It was a warm spring night in the year of 2000. I was going to be at Quail Ridge Bookstore for my first signing of my book, Flame Out, from prosecuting Jeffrey McDonald to serving time to serving tables. It was going to be a nice evening. There's going to be a good crowd there. Sarah Avery of the Raleigh News and Observer had just a day or so before printed a great article in the paper about my book signing. She was the same reporter for the paper who had years before written a story about me for a Sunday feature about the fall of Jim Blackburn. We had become friends while I was on work release, and she had even actually come to Senator Morgan's office and had lunch with me and talked about it all. Go figure. I had a small reception given for me that night by Stephanie Gibbs. Stephanie had been a reporter for the Charlotte Observer, had edited my initial manuscript when she was at the beach and got stuck there during a hurricane and had nothing else to do but read my manuscript. She is now a partner in a major law firm in Raleigh, having graduated from law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she is a family law practitioner, excellent lawyer. So I had gotten 4 books from the printer 2 or 3 days before, and I took the 4 books to Quail Ridge Bookstore and gave them to them. They put them up on the counter for sale, and Nancy Olson, who is the owner of the store, told me they sold the first afternoon, all 4 of them. That was a good beginning, a good idea. So then, you know, she decided, Jim, I want to buy 4 cases of books. 4 cases of books. Yes. And Jim, I'm going to pay you by check the night of the book signing. We're going to set you up at a table, puts a stack of books on the side, and let people get in line and come by and you can sign and give them a book. It's great. And there are 32 books in a case. So I was off and running. There were a lot of people there that night. Some I may not have known very well. There were family, there were friends, people from the United States Attorney's Office where I'd worked years before. There's a lawyer named Gene Boyce, who's a well-known lawyer in Raleigh. I had known Gene for many, many years. I knew his wife, Pat, longer than I known Gene. She was the beauty queen in the spring of the early 1950s at Wake Forest, in the town of Wake Forest. And I was a little kid doing a pole dance around her as we were doing a skit on Hans Christian Andersen. So I had known her a long time. Jean had supported me in my writing of the books and had introduced me to Stephanie Gibbs, who was the editor for me. And then there was I. Beverly Lake Jr., who became the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. He was there. I had known Beverly for many years. We had worked in the Attorney General's office together once. And I knew his dad, who had also become a Supreme Court justice. His dad was the person who had befriended Robert Morgan when he was in law school at Wake Forest, with Robert living with him for a time, and spoke to Robert about hiring my good young friend, Jim Blackburn. And that's my contact to meeting Robert Morgan in the late 1960s when I started work at the Attorney General's office in the fall of 1969. So there I am. I looked around the room and I spied one more person. His name was Rags. Rags had been an inmate with me at Wake Correctional. He was there. I had befriended him, telling him where to go to get help for his hand when he'd gotten hurt, recommended a doctor, a hand specialist in Raleigh. So Rags was there, blue jeans, white t-shirt, to hear me speak and buy a book. It said more to me that Rags was there than almost anybody else in the room. We sold over 60 books that night, signed them all. The Secretary of State was there from North Carolina. She just happened to walk into the bookstore. I saw her and said, "You need to buy one of these books." And she looked at me. She said, "Well, what can I do?" So she walked over and bought one. Good for her. Welcome, folks, today to my new podcast for this week, Song of Resilience, writing a book. It was probably a Saturday morning. I don't know which month, either in the late winter or early spring of 1994, when I was sitting on the top bunk in a large dorm room, trying to figure out what I was going to do the rest of that day and what was going on in my brain. And all of a sudden, I remembered that Judge Dupree had once said to me, "You need to write a book about this, gentleman. Come the heck back." And so the idea came to me about writing about all of this. I remember that I needed to take notes because I would forget one day the circumstances of the room in which I was in. I needed to write it all down. So I looked around at the light brown, tan cinder block walls, the many lights that were there, how many beds there were, where the showers were, the people. Tried to remember my friend Ricky Carver, who lived next door about 2 feet away, Smitty, who lived under me, Dwight, who wanted to take me riding on a motorcycle across the country when we got out, and my best friend, I suppose, in prison, Joe Spence. Joe had been there a long time. He never got free. He never got out. He was there because he had participated in a killing of a cab driver in Greensboro with a co-defendant years earlier. He had been on work release, going to his mother's house on the weekends for years. His co-defendant had been released. Joe never made it. I tried to get him some help through Robert Morgan later on after I was out, but it came to no good end, and he finally died of cancer in prison. It was very sad. I got up that morning, that Saturday morning, went outside and walked around the track. They had not a long track, but it was a small track. But you could walk on the track and sort of be by yourself. And if anybody was walking with you, it was because they wanted to talk to you about something. And that was okay. So I just walked around the track time after time after time. It went up near the fence, which is a tall chain link fence with rolling barbed wire on the top, which would cut you to smithereens if you tried to get out. There was minimum security, so guards didn't have a gun, which is probably a good thing. But anyway, That's what I did that day. And as I did, I thought about the idea of writing a book, and it made me feel better. And I began to smile just a bit, even if just to myself. I had some paper and I wrote down some of my thoughts, the names of people, what it was like, who I saw, what the food was like, everything, because I would want to include this in a book. When I got out that year, I remember going to the beach with my family. And in the afternoon, when it was really hot outside, I would sit in a room where we were staying with my laptop computer and type furiously, trying to write a book. I was going really through my journal that I had been keeping and had printed since the early part of 1993, a year earlier, year and a half earlier. So I had some documents that I could go back and refresh my memory. I thought it'd be a great book. Thought it would be a bestseller. This was how I was going to come back and make lots of money and be a writer. And I felt good during that week's vacation. Got back to Raleigh, wrote a letter, probably sent some of the drafts of my manuscript off. And after about a month or so, got 2 or 3 letters back. I didn't send it to many publishing houses, and they were all very polite. They're all very nice letters. They were form letters, I suppose, or close to a form letter. But anyway, they said no. But one of them said, Mr. Blackburn, memoirs, which this is sort of like, simply do not sell very well unless you're immensely famous. And even some of those don't sell well. Political books written by people running for president of the United States never sell very well. They're vanity books more than anything else for the candidate. So then I kept writing. Decided I would self-publish it myself, or at least keep on going to see what I could do. Gave it to some friends to read, thinking they would come back and say, Jim, this is just marvelous. They did not like it. It did not go well. They were unanimous. It had no theme, they said. It was just a recitation month by month of what I'd gone through. I remember going to lunch one Sunday morning, my family and my father, his wife. It did not go well. I had referenced my dad in the book, and while I didn't mean it to be unflattering, I suppose he took it that way. And that when he had been a minister at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem years before, he had separated and divorced from my mother. And anyway, without going on to all the details, it was somewhat scandalous. And he left Winston-Salem to work elsewhere. And I made up my mind I would never run or walk away, no matter what happened. I would stay in Raleigh, would face it. He didn't like that. I wrote all that. And said so, saying, Jim, nobody's going to buy this book. It's no good. It's just, you need to give this up. But I kept trying, kept walking, walked miles and miles up Ridge Road every day, 3 to 5 miles a day. Talked to myself, and decided I would try again. I would start over again. I basically tossed aside everything that I had written before, all of it. I kept the general idea, and I would have chapters, a chapter or two about going to see Dr. Spalding, mental health issues, a chapter about screwing the heck up, a couple of chapters about going to Wake Correctional, one about waiting tables. And I would see how long it would go. I went to the bookstores around town, looked at books, saw how much they were charging for a book. I counted the number of words on a page. There were a little over 300 words to a page. And that's how I figured out how many pages it might be and how long I wanted my book to be. And I recognized the number of pages that were in some of these books. So I got it together, finished my manuscript, did not write it in logical sequential order, but jumped around. I started with the easy one first. I did probably close to it was the 42nd Street Oyster Bar, because that was fun. Writing about waiting tables was fun. I wrote about going to see Jean Spalding because I could remember it so well, and I was going to see her every day or every week, and she wanted to know how I was doing on it. And I kept going. And I made up my mind I would not criticize anybody or say anything unkind about anyone. I would just write my story and talk about myself and the friends that I had met and the circumstances of it all. The only person I would criticize would be myself. That's all. Then I had to get it published. Back then, it's in the stone ages of self-publishing. And I had no money, none. But I had some friends who had credit cards. This was a time when they had lots of credit cards going around. And each one of them had one or two cards with a zero balance in it. And you could get a cash advance, or you could use their credit card. So I borrowed from about 4 or 5 people, 4 or 5 credit cards, told them up front what I wanted to do, how I was going to do it, and that I would pay them back everything from the proceeds of the sale of the book. And lo and behold, they did that. I think I raised close to $10,000 that way. It was expensive back then to self-publish because you had to order a certain number of books. I think I ordered probably 2,500 to 3,500 books, and about $6, $7 a book. So it ran into some money. Then I had to, who would help me publish it? Who would help design a book? I didn't know anything about designing a book. And someone told me that there was a little small book design company in Pittsburgh named Kuchergis Book Design with Ann Thilgard and her mother. They ran this books publishing business, which mainly did textbooks for colleges and universities. But for some reason, they liked my idea of what I was doing, and they agreed to take me on. But of course, I had to pay them some money. It wasn't a huge amount, but I had to pay them some money to do this. I decided to make up gift cards. The book was going to cost $17.95, so that with tax, it'd be payable with a $20 bill, which is what I wanted to do. So I sent out notes to people and had gift cards. And if you would agree to pre-purchase one of my books for $2 less, $15.95, I would make sure that you got one of the first copies when it came out. And do you know, lo and behold, people did that. And I raised a bunch of money that way. Still, some humorous stories came from that. One night, a good friend of mine who was a hostess at the Oyster Bar and dating the manager of the Oyster Bar, who is now a wonderful lawyer in Raleigh and Wake County, we were having a glass of wine at a restaurant downtown or near downtown. And neither of us had any money. We could pay for one glass of wine. But we wanted another one. Maybe we'd split it, you know? Just that time, my friend Lorraine, who waited tables with us at Oyster Bar, walked in the door. Said, "Lorraine, what?" "Well, look, I've got this gift certificate I can give to you for $15.95 for my book. It's $2 off. You want to buy it? Your name's going to be in the book." My name's in the book. Yes, which it is in the book. And she said, yeah, I got some cash. I'll give you $16 right now. Great. And I gave her a gift certificate. She walked out the door of the restaurant. I looked at my friend and said, we just bought us another glass of wine. And we were off to the races. Still one of my favorite stories from that time. I wanted the book to be good. This was not just a vanity project. I wanted to stand for a test of time. I wanted to show the evolution of my thinking from the time I was charged, when I had told this law firm what had happened, to how I thought now, having lost my right to practice law, having been charged with criminal wrongdoing, having served a little over 3 months in state prison, even though it was minimum security, it was still prison, having no job, except I hadn't really started doing much except waiting tables at that point, which was something I had never done before in my life. I decided I would start out with the story of Jeffrey McDonald. Not because I was so fascinated with Jeffrey McDonald, but I thought other people might be. I oftentimes refer to this as the sex of the book. It would be the lure that would get people to buy the book and read it, and hoping that they would read the rest of it. So his story and my prosecution of McDonald, along with other people's participation in the prosecution, was how we started the book, the first 2 or 3 chapters. That was not hard to write. I could do it almost totally from memory and in my sleep. It was a hook to get people to buy the book. I then decided I needed to write about depression, about mental illness, going to Duke Psychiatric Hospital in Durham. And I did that because I wanted people to know what it was like. And I wanted people to know that it was okay to talk about it, and it was okay to go. This was the first time I had ever written about my medical diagnosis with Dr. Spaulding. It was the first time I'd ever really spoken about the medication that I took, the number of visits I had, the fact that I was in Duke Hospital. And I figured that if I could say that I had done all of these things, then maybe someone else would say, maybe I need some help too. And if Jim can do it, I can do it. That's what I wanted. That's why I wrote that. I wrote about the mistakes that I made that caused me to leave the law firm and get charged with violations of law. Not because I had to, though I probably did, but to show that I tried to learn how to be accountable for my mistakes, and that you could still live your life even after doing that, that there was hope beyond a disaster. A friend of mine, Frank Daniels, who at that time was the publisher and the owner of the Raleigh News and Observer, back when it was really a big newspaper, took me to breakfast one day at Big Ed's in downtown Raleigh, and said, "You know, Jim, you misnamed your book. You called it Flame Out. You should have had another title. You sold more books." I said, "Well, Frank, what would you have called it?" He said, "Well, Jim, I think I ought to call it How to Come Back When You're Really Effed Up." And I laughed. I said, "Well, if you put that on the cover, I bet you people going through the airport, the bookstores, before they get on the plane and saw that title, I bet you they would buy the book. He said, that's what I'm talking about. So maybe if I write another book about it, that's something like that is what I would say. I don't know. Frank was a good friend. I wrote about suicide or the possibility of suicide because I wanted to know people what it was like to think that way and not do it, and what would keep someone from not doing it. As I've written in my book and said on previous podcasts and in all my talks, humor with my daughter Stacy and the amount of money I would get if I went to Hilton Head. I wrote that in there to show the value and wisdom of humor and laughter. It generally always gets a laugh when I tell that story, which was my purpose. And my idea that suicide is, I don't think, the right way for anybody to go. It's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I wrote about my dealings with my lawyers, Wade and Rick, to show two things. One, their unconditional friendship with me. And secondly, that friends could represent friends and survive. Though we stretched it to the nth degree, I will be honest and tell you, it never broke. It's like a team on a football field giving up lots of yards, but never, and bending a great deal, but never breaking. We bent a lot, but we never broke. I wanted to show what Wade had said to me about pleading guilty to everything because I wanted to show the idea of tough love and the necessity sometimes to tell people what they do not want to hear, but what they must and should hear to survive and get better. I wrote about prison in order to draw back the curtain and let people just see what it was like, at least in the lower level that I knew about when I was there. But that you can go to a place like this and come back to freedom. You can survive that. I did interviews with the newspaper, with the News Observer, and almost anybody would talk to me. I would talk to them. Not because I wanted to see my name in print, but because I thought it was important that people know that I was still here and that I was still alive and I was not going to go away, that I wanted to survive, and that maybe they might be able to survive whatever was going on in their life. I learned not to criticize anyone for anything, just to show the wisdom of just taking it. When I went back to prison a second time, I wrote about that too. Not to get sympathy, but to show that being graceful about a difficult adversarial situation can bring you great reward. And so when I was asked, did I want to say anything to the parole board for making a mistake on accounting for my time? I said, no, I don't want to say anything other than the fact that we all make mistakes and they are not the reason I'm here. I'm the reason I'm here. Wade Smith oftentimes has told me over the years that was the smartest thing I've ever said. I wrote about Jeffrey McDonald, not just for the sex of the book, as I mentioned, but in thinking back about it, I wanted to show people my past as a lawyer and who I once was. Actually, the reason for writing my book was to give myself some purpose in life, some purpose. to find myself. And it required me looking hard to find myself and to see whether there was anything worth preserving. I wanted to find what I would call my voice. In the early pages of the book, I wrote about several thoughts that I thought were important. They have stood the test of time. I thought that to start over, come back, that you had to have several traits, at least for a short time, to do so. One of them is faith. I've oftentimes thought the best definition of faith I've ever heard is that that's what you have when you get ready to step off of a cliff and you think you will learn to fly. That would be faith. I wrote about humility, the idea of not only working at the oyster bar and for tips, but the humility of going as gracefully as I could into custody, wearing handcuffs, leg irons, whatever it was to do. The best example I can give of that was something I've told before. One Saturday afternoon, I was in Wake Correctional. It came over the loudspeaker that I was supposed to report to the office right away. So I went to the office, and right before I got there, the loudspeaker came back on and said that request is denied. And so I walked on to the office anyway and went inside. What's that all about? And one of the guys said, well, we were going to have you pick up paper. And then my supervisor said, we can't ask Jim to pick up paper. You just can't ask him to do that. I said, no, guys, you misunderstand. Picking up paper would be good for me. It would be good for me. It wouldn't be bad. I would do that. I didn't do it. They said, no, we don't want you to do that. But I would have that's a good thing. Always try to do whatever it is to show that you're no better than anybody else. I showed and wrote about laughter. Laughter not only with the conversation with Stacy about going to Hilton Head and suicide, but the laughter of 42nd Street, or the laughter with some of my comments and thoughts to Jean Spalding when she said that I thought about suicide in one of my first meetings. I said, no, but do you think I should? And she looked at me with this menacing glare on her face when I said that. I learned that you always have to give your best. And that's what I write about. I learned that you have to give and accept unconditional love without condition and unconditional friendship. It's very important to learn to be happy and do whatever that is that makes you happy. You have to learn to forgive yourself and others, to always go the second or third mile and never give up. And most importantly, I write about that you always need to believe in angels. In the early part of my book, in the thank you section, I wrote about a number of people, and I won't go through all their names there. They're in the book. A couple of people who worked with me at the law firm, Melanie and Allison, who stood by me the whole time, took me to lunch on occasion. There was George, who drove me to work release every day. Brent, who helped me raise money for the printing of the book. Judy Davis is a name I've never mentioned. She was the second editor for my book and is actually the person who came up with the name Flame Out. She wrote all of the comments under every picture in the book, because by that time I was too tired of writing on the book to do it anymore. And she said, I can do that for you. My friend Frank Calvert from West Jefferson, North Carolina, lifelong friend who encouraged me to write the book. Frank didn't pay any attention to me because he later killed himself. when he got into financial trouble. The one person that I need to let you know was Mary Mac Pope. Mary Mac was the first female Superior Court judge in North Carolina. She was from Moore County. She practiced law as a family practitioner after she was no longer a Superior Court judge. She made wonderful gourmet meals for me. She lived near one of the major golf courses there, rented out her home during tournament time. She bought lots of my books. She read every draft, told me what I should focus on, and the tone of it. She would tell me when the tone was pitch perfect and when it was not. One night at the Oyster Bar, we were sitting in the booth, and she said, "Bring 35 books with you." I took 35 books, and do you know, she bought all 35 books that night and sat there and had me autograph every one, and she gave them away as Christmas presents. And of course, my daughter Stacy, who read every word of the manuscript and criticized me as almost nobody else can and would do, and the writing that I was doing, and made it better. Later on, years later, I went back to have another printing of the book done and did an afterword and had a new book jacket cover. The book jacket cover, which is really a pretty cool cover, was done by Gretchen Long, Stanton, Virginia. It was one of the best graphic design people you have ever met or would ever meet in your life. You should Google her name. And if you ever need anything, she is the one to go to. Her name is Gretchen Long. In the afterward, I talk about a young girl whose name I've now lost. She was a paralegal from Rocky Mount, Wilson area. She came to one of my seminars one day. Wonderful young girl, probably in her 30s. Her dad had been a lawyer. She'd had some mental health issues, she said, and wanted to go to lunch with me and talk about it. We made an agreement to do so, and I would call her the following week, which of course I did, and I got no answer. And I kept calling 3 or 4 times, still no answer, and she didn't return my call. I sent her emails, they did not bounce back. I only learned a couple of years later that she had killed herself. She had killed herself. They had come to her house to commit her to a mental facility, and she was ready and dressed to the nines to go. And she said, "Well, rather than let me go to the restroom and I'll be right back." She walked into the restroom, the first floor of the house, locked the door, pulled out a gun, and shot and killed herself. So it was important. It is important to write and talk about mental health issues and going to a hospital and knowing that it's okay. One of my best conversations was with the former newspaper publisher of the News and Observer, John Drescher, whose daughter Ann did one of my podcasts as a doctoral student at UNC. John wanted to do a story on me one day for the Sunday edition of the paper over Labor Day, which I don't know whether it'd be a good day to be on the paper or not for that weekend. But anyway, he wanted to write about it. And he calls me on the cell phone one day, and I said, "Hey, John." He said, "Well, Jim, I want to write about you." I said, "John, I haven't done anything wrong for a while." He said, "Well, recently you haven't done anything wrong." I said, "Well, that's true. And I want to write about you." "Why?" "I want you to give advice to John and Elizabeth Edwards. You know them." I said, "Well, I do, but I'm not going to do that, John. You think I'm crazy?" "Well, can you talk to me anyway? And we did. And I did not say anything about them other than good things. But I said, John, I need to say this to you. Your newspaper used to carry wonderful stories about me. You even once made me the Tar Heel of the Week, for gosh sakes. Wonderful stories. And then you wrote some that were not quite as good with somewhat severe headlines. He said, that's true. I said, John, your newspaper helped to save my life. He said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, because once everybody knows about the mistakes that you make in your life, they know. And you don't have to run or hide from it any longer. And you can go on with living your life and find out who your friends are. That's what I learned from your stories. I write about my friend Carolyn Tara Stone, whom I've talked about previously. Tara's the young 16 or 17-year-old girl who was in a tragic car accident but was not killed. Carolyn was the paralegal from Dunn who her husband looked after her until her death many, many years later, and forgave the boy who was driving the car. Was never fatally bitter about it, didn't sue anybody, just loved her daughter, thought she had fulfilled her purpose in life by giving good feelings to those who came by her room in the nursing home in Dunn and made them smile and feel better. I remember being told the story, and I write about it in my afterword, about several young men in Wilmington who were being sentenced for drinking underage. They were all there. They were lawyered up. They were dressed the best they could be. And the judge said to each one, I'm going to give you probation, provided you promise me you will not drink again until you reach majority age. And they all said, yes, sir, we won't do that. Thank you, sir. And one young man in the group declined to do that. And the judge looked at him and says, do you not understand that if you can't promise me that you won't drink again, I can't promise you that I won't do something more severe to you? He said, I understand. Why are you not going to say that to me? Because, Your Honor, I don't know. I might, one day drink again before I should. I may not, I don't intend to right now, but I might. I don't want to lie to you, Judge. I have too much respect for the situation I'm in and who you are. The judge looked at him sternly, sat back in his chair, and then he smiled and said, young man, I suspect that you are the only one here today who has told me the truth. And for that, I am going to completely dismiss your case and expunge everything from the record that you were ever here. That might not happen very often, but it might. And even if it doesn't, there is something to be said for telling the truth about your situation when you don't know what the consequences will be. So this is my book. This is my song of resilience. This is why I wrote my book, Flame Out. It was first suggested to me by Judge Dupree in his chambers in the office of the federal building in Raleigh. The idea came back to me when I was sitting on the top bunk of my bed in Wake Correctional. I remember telling him that my goal was to walk down the streets of Raleigh once again and to be able to hold my head up. After I wrote my book, I walked down the streets one day and saw in the window of a restaurant, a very, very old and exceedingly popular, always full at lunch restaurant, the Mecca. Anybody who's ever lived or worked in downtown Raleigh knows about the Mecca. And at this time, it was owned by a family, the DeBallis family, and it was John DeBallis, who's the proprietor and the manager and the owner of the Mecca, along with his wife, who did the cashier work. And in the window of this restaurant was a copy of my book that everybody would see as they walked in. And it was there for a long time. John has passed away now, but I've never forgotten the kindness he showed by doing just that, putting a copy of my book in the window of his restaurant in downtown Raleigh. This was my way of trying to come back, as Judge Dupree had suggested. But of course, coming back, starting over is not a destination. It's like happiness. It's not a destination. It's a journey that you're always going to be on for the rest of your life. But it's one well worth taking. At my sentencing hearing, Colin Willoughby, who was my friend and district attorney at the time, read at the conclusion of his remarks a portion, if not all, of the poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. There's some words at the end of that poem that apply to seeking resilience, at least in the way that I did it. And I want to read just a few lines to you right now. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Well, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thanks very much for seeing or listening to this podcast, Song of Resilience, writing a book. I hope you have a great week, and I hope to see you soon next week on another edition of my podcast, Grit, Stories of Resilience.